high-security federal prison in the heart of New York. A man under constant watch, connected to one of the biggest investigations in the world. And yet, within hours, Jeffrey Epstein was found dead inside his cell. No trial, no answers in court, just a single question that still divides the world. How does someone like that die inside a maximum security facility? What happened in the final hours of Cell 21 is still one of the most debated mysteries in modern history.
August 10th, 2019. Inside a high-security federal prison in New York, a piece of news shocked the world. Jeffrey Epstein, a man already at the center of one of the most controversial criminal investigations in modern history, was found dead inside his jail cell. He was waiting for a trial that could have revealed new evidence, witness testimonies, and answers to years of questions. But before that trial ever began, Epstein was gone. The official conclusion was suicide, but almost immediately, questions started appearing. How could one of the most watched prisoners in America die inside a federal facility? Why did security failures happen at the exact moment the world was watching? And why did his final hours become a mystery that people still debate today? This is not just the story of one man's death. It is the story of Cell 21, a case filled with unanswered questions, investigations, and a search for the truth. But to understand the mystery, first, we need to understand who Jeffrey Epstein really was and why his name became connected to one of the biggest investigations of the century.
Before Jeffrey Epstein became one of the most controversial names in the world, he was known as a wealthy financier with connections to powerful circles. For years, he built a public image around money, influence, and access. But behind that image, a much darker investigation was developing. Over several years, multiple people came forward with allegations accusing Epstein of serious crimes involving exploitation and abuse. These allegations eventually led to investigations by law enforcement. In 2008, Epstein reached a controversial plea agreement in Florida after facing state charges. The deal became heavily criticized because many people questioned whether the punishment matched the seriousness of the allegations. Years later, new investigations reopened the case, and in 2019, federal authorities arrested Epstein on new charges. This time, the world was watching. The case was no longer hidden. It became a major investigation involving documents, witnesses, and questions about how someone with so much influence remained protected for so long. But just as the legal process was moving forward, a new mystery began. Because only weeks after his arrest, Jeffrey Epstein would enter a prison cell that would become one of the most discussed places in modern criminal history, Cell 21. After his 2019 arrest, Jeffrey Epstein was taken to the Metropolitan Correctional Center in Manhattan, a federal detention facility designed for high-profile and dangerous inmates. This was not an ordinary prison. Security was supposed to be strict. Every movement was controlled. Every prisoner was monitored. And for someone like Epstein, the attention was higher than ever. Because he was not just another inmate. He was a person connected to a case that had attracted worldwide attention. Inside the prison, Epstein was placed in a special housing unit, an area where inmates could receive additional monitoring and protection. But on the night of August 9, 2019, a series of events would later become the focus of intense investigation. His cellmate was moved, he was left alone, and the level of supervision around him became one of the biggest questions after his death. A prisoner at the center of a global investigation inside a high-security facility was suddenly in a situation where important safety measures had failed, and the next few hours would change the entire story forever. Because by the morning, Cell 21 would become the center of one of the most debated mysteries in recent history. August 10th, 2019. Early morning inside the Metropolitan Correctional Center. Correctional officers arrived for their routine duties, but inside Cell 21, they found Jeffrey Epstein unresponsive. The news spread almost instantly. A man who was supposed to face trial, a man whose case had captured global attention, was suddenly gone. The official investigation began immediately. Authorities examined the scene. They reviewed prison procedures, and they started looking into one major question.
how did this happen inside a facility built around security? Soon, details about that night began raising concerns. The officers responsible for checking Epstein had failed to complete required rounds. Later investigations revealed that prison staff had not followed proper procedures. Records showed serious failures in monitoring. And then came another issue: surveillance. The prison relied on cameras and security systems to monitor activity, but problems with the surveillance around the area created even more questions about what happened during those final hours. A place designed to prevent mistakes had experienced multiple failures at once.
And as investigators searched for answers, the public started asking a bigger question. Was this only a story about prison negligence, or was there something more that needed to be uncovered? The focus now shifted from the cell to the evidence. As investigators looked deeper into the final hours of Jeffrey Epstein, one thing became clear. The biggest questions were not only about what happened inside the cell, but about everything that failed around it. According to later reports, the officers assigned to monitor Epstein were supposed to perform regular checks throughout the night, but those checks were not completed properly. The guards later admitted to sleeping during their shifts and falsifying records. For a high-profile prisoner, this was a massive security failure. Then came the issue of surveillance. A facility designed to track movement and maintain control had problems with camera coverage in the area. For many people watching the case, this became one of the most suspicious parts. How could a prisoner receiving worldwide attention be left without proper monitoring? Was this simply a breakdown caused by human mistakes, or did a series of failures create the perfect conditions for a tragedy?
Official investigations focused on negligence and failures inside the prison system, but public debate continued because in a case already filled with questions, every mistake became another piece of the mystery. After Epstein's death, a full medical examination was conducted to determine the cause. The New York City medical examiner officially ruled the death as suicide by hanging. For the authorities, this was the conclusion of the medical side of the case, but for others, it was not the end of the discussion. Independent forensic experts reviewed the publicly available information and raised questions about certain findings. One of the most discussed opinions came from Dr. Michael Baden, a forensic pathologist hired by Epstein's family. He pointed to specific fractures found in the neck area and suggested they were unusual compared to typical cases of suicidal hanging. However, other forensic specialists explained that neck injuries can vary depending on conditions, and similar fractures can also appear in different types of deaths. This difference in interpretation created a public debate. Was the medical conclusion fully clear, or were there details that required further clarification? At this stage, the case was no longer only about prison security. It had become a combination of forensic science, interpretation, and disagreement among experts. And as this debate continued, another major question remained in the background. What would have happened if Epstein had lived long enough to face trial? Because the case against him was still active, and the investigation was far from over. And then came the part that created even more controversy: the forensic evidence, the examination of what happened inside cell 21.
At the time of his death, Jeffrey Epstein was awaiting a federal trial in the United States. This was not a minor case. It involved years of investigation, financial records, witness statements, and multiple lines of evidence being reviewed by federal authorities. Court documents and filings showed that prosecutors were preparing to present a wide-ranging case, a case that could have expanded far beyond one individual. Because in investigations like this, the focus is not only on the accused, but also on networks, connections, and documented interactions. As the case moved forward, more evidence was being collected and analyzed, but before it could reach a courtroom, the trial never happened. After Epstein's death, the criminal case against him was dismissed. Legally, the process ended, but the broader questions did not. What would a full trial have revealed? Which parts of the investigation would have been tested in court?
And how much of the case remained unresolved when everything stopped? For many observers, this is where the story shifted, because it was no longer only about guilt or innocence. It became about what was lost when the trial never took place. And that leads to the final part of the mystery. What remains after cell 21? After Jeffrey Epstein's death, the story did not end inside the prison. It spread far beyond it. Almost immediately, public reaction split into different directions. Some accepted the official conclusion. Others questioned how so many failures could happen at the same time inside a federal facility. The combination of security breakdowns, missing surveillance coverage, and procedural mistakes
created widespread debate. News outlets around the world began analyzing every detail of the case. Online discussions grew even faster. People re-examined timelines, reports, and official statements. For many, the case was no longer just about one individual. It became a broader discussion about accountability, systems, and trust in institutions. Why were required procedures not followed? How did multiple safeguards fail in a high-security environment? And why did the case continue to generate questions even after official explanations were released? Over time, Epstein's death became more than an event. It became a symbol of unanswered questions in a high-profile investigation. And as debate continued, attention turned back to the place where it all happened, Cell 21.
As investigators reviewed the case, one of the most important steps was reconstructing the final timeline inside the prison. The goal was simple: to understand what likely happened in the hours before Jeffrey Epstein was found unresponsive. Based on reports and official findings, Epstein was inside his cell during the night of August 9, 2019. He was supposed to be under regular monitoring. Correctional officers were assigned to conduct routine checks throughout the night, but those checks were not properly completed. Logs were later found to be inaccurate, and records showed that required procedures were not followed. At the same time, surveillance coverage in the area did not provide a complete view of the critical angles outside the cell. This meant that key moments during the night were not clearly recorded. By the morning, Epstein was discovered inside his cell. The exact sequence of events inside those final hours remains based on reconstruction, reports, and available records. Not a complete recording, not a fully documented timeline, just a combination of known facts and missing pieces. And that gap became one of the central reasons this case continued to be discussed. Because in investigations like this, what is missing can sometimes be as important as what is known. Officially, Jeffrey Epstein's death was ruled as suicide. That remains the conclusion of the medical examiner and federal authorities. But even years later, the case continues to be discussed, analyzed, and questioned. Not because the official findings do not exist, but because the circumstances surrounding the case left behind unresolved concerns in the public mind. A high-profile prisoner, a federal facility designed for maximum security, multiple procedural failures recorded in official investigations, and a final outcome that ended a major criminal case before it reached trial. For investigators, the case is closed, but for many observers, the questions remain open. What happened inside Cell 21 is not only about one night in a prison. It is about how a complex investigation ended in a way that still generates debate. And it is about the gap between official conclusions and the questions that continue to exist outside of them. In the end, the mystery is not only how Jeffrey Epstein died, it is why this case continues to be one of the most discussed investigations of modern times. This is History Speaks.